The blood-stained telegram trembled in Sarah Crawford's hands as she stood frozen on her porch. The Montana Territory sunset painting the sky in cruel beauty that mocked her grief. "Dead," it said simply of her husband Thomas, killed in a mining accident that had taken not just his life, but her reason for being in this harsh frontier land of 1878. Sarah had been waiting 3 months for his return from the silver mines near Butte, planning their future together, never imagining she would become a widow at 26. The small ranch house they'd built together now felt like a hollow reminder of dreams that would never come true. Neighbors came by with food and condolences in the days that followed. They meant well, but their words bounced off the shield of numbness surrounding her. The minister spoke of God's mysterious ways, but Sarah found no comfort there. Thomas had been her strength, her faith, her certainty in an uncertain world. "I don't understand," she told Mrs. Porter, the elderly woman who lived on the neighboring homestead. "We did everything right. We worked hard, we prayed, we helped others. Why would God take him, Mrs.?" Porter had no answer, just a wrinkled hand on her shoulder and tears in her faded eyes. A week after the telegram arrived, Sarah stared at the accounts book. The ranch was paid for, but winter was coming. Thomas had been due back with the money from 6 months of mining work. There was little in the way of savings, and the small herd of cattle wouldn't sustain her through the harsh Montana winter without help. That afternoon, she hitched the wagon and drove into Pinecrest, the small but growing town 15 miles from her homestead. The journey was rough, the rutted trail made more difficult by her distracted mind. The wagon wheel caught in a deep hole, nearly toppling the entire vehicle, and Sarah fought to control the startled horses. "Steady there," she whispered, surprising herself with the calmness in her voice. The horses settled, and she continued on, more carefully now. Pinecrest was bustling with activity. A new saloon had opened since her last visit, and the sounds of a piano drifted into the street. Several rail workers crowded the boardwalk, evidence of the approaching Northern Pacific line that promised to bring prosperity to the region. Sarah headed straight for Wilson's Mercantile, where Thomas had an arrangement to purchase supplies on credit until his return from the mines. Mr. Wilson's face fell when he saw her enter, her black mourning dress making explanations unnecessary. "Mrs. Crawford, I'm deeply sorry for your loss," he said, removing his spectacles. "Thomas was a good man." "Thank you, Mr. Wilson," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. "I've come to settle our account and make arrangements for winter supplies." Wilson shifted uncomfortably. Of course, though I understood Thomas would be bringing payment upon his return." "My husband is dead, Mr. Wilson. There will be no payment from the mines." Her bluntness surprised even her. "I can offer a portion of my cattle come slaughter time, but I need supplies now." Wilson looked genuinely pained. "Mrs. Crawford, I wish I could help, but I've extended too much credit already. The railroad delays have affected everyone's finances." Sarah stood tall, refusing to beg. "I see, then I'll take what I can afford today and make other arrangements." She left the store with barely enough flour and coffee to last a month, her mind racing with calculations of survival. As she loaded her meager purchases, a commotion drew her attention to the main street. A group of cowboys had ridden into town, trail dust coating their clothes and horses. From their appearance and the brand on the horses, Sarah recognized them as hands from the Big Sky Ranch, owned by Harold Blackburn, the wealthiest rancher in the territory. One of the men, tall and broad-shouldered with a sun-weathered face, separated from the group and headed toward the telegraph office. Something in his stride, purposeful but unhurried, caught Sarah's attention. He removed his hat as he entered the building, revealing sandy brown hair and a profile that suggested strength without cruelty. Sarah returned to her task, forcing her mind back to practical matters. She would need to consider selling most of her cattle now rather than waiting for better prices. Perhaps she could take in laundry or offer her services as a seamstress. As she climbed onto the wagon seat, a shout and the sound of pounding hooves pulled her attention back to the street. A riderless horse was charging down the main thoroughfare, sending pedestrians scattering. Behind it ran a young boy of about 8, tears streaming down his face. Without thinking, Sarah jumped from the wagon and positioned herself in the horse's path, her arms outstretched. The animal, eyes wild with fear, bore down on her. At the last moment, she stepped aside while grabbing for the trailing reins, a move Thomas had taught her years ago. The horse's momentum nearly pulled her arm from its socket, but she held on, speaking softly to the frightened animal until it slowed and finally stopped, trembling and blowing. The boy caught up, his face streaked with dust and tears. "Thank you, madam, that's my pa's horse. He'd have tanned my hide if I'd lost him." "You're welcome," Sarah replied, handing over the reins. "Though perhaps you shouldn't mention to your father that you nearly got trampled trying to catch him." A voice from behind her made her turn. "That was either the bravest or most foolish thing I've seen in a month of Sundays." It was the cowboy she'd noticed earlier, his expression a mixture of admiration and concern. "Sometimes there's not much difference between the two out here," Sarah replied, suddenly conscious of her dusty morning dress and wind-blown hair. He smiled, revealing a small gap between his front teeth that somehow added character to his handsome face. "I reckon that's true enough. Name's Benjamin Hayes, madam. Most folks call me Ben." Sarah Crawford. She did not offer her hand, aware of the impropriety of such a gesture between strangers, especially given her recent widowhood. "You handled that horse like someone who knows their way around livestock, Mrs. Crawford." "My husband and I run," she caught herself, the present tense like a knife twist. "I have a small ranch outside of town." Something in her tone must have conveyed her situation, for understanding flickered in Ben's eyes. He glanced at her black dress, then at the sparsely loaded wagon. "Heading back alone?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Yes, Mr. Hayes, I can manage." Ben looked at the sky. "It'll be dark in a couple of hours. Road's not the safest after sundown, what with the railway camp so close." Sarah straightened her shoulders. "I appreciate your concern, but I'll be fine." Ben nodded, respecting her independence. "At least let me check your wagon before you go. That right wheel looked wobbly when you pulled in." Before she could object, he was examining the wheel, his experienced hands finding what she had missed. "The axle pin's coming loose. 10 more miles and you'd have been stranded." He worked efficiently, using tools from his saddlebag to make the repair. Sarah watched his capable hands, remembering how Thomas had always maintained their wagon with the same attention to detail. "There," Ben said finally, wiping his hands on a bandana. "That should get you home safely." "Thank you, Mr. Hayes. What do I owe you for the repair?" He looked genuinely surprised by the question. "Nothing at all, Mrs. Crawford, just being neighborly." As Sarah started to climb onto the wagon, Ben cleared his throat. "Mrs. Crawford, the Big Sky is looking for experienced hands for the fall roundup. Good pay, and the work's not as hard as mining or railroad building. Are you suggesting I apply for cowhand work, Mr. Hayes?" Sarah asked, not sure whether to be amused or offended. He smiled again, that crooked, genuine smile. "No, madam, but we also need a cook for the bunkhouse. Our last one quit to open that new saloon. It's decent work if you don't mind feeding 20 hungry men." Sarah considered the offer. Cooking for a ranch crew would mean leaving her own place unattended, but the pay would see her through the winter. Still, pride made her hesitate. "I'll think on it, Mr. Hayes. Thank you for the suggestion." As she drove away, Sarah caught sight of Ben Hayes in the mercantile window, watching her departure with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. The journey home seemed longer than the trip into town. Thoughts of Thomas mingled with practical concerns about survival and unbidden observations about the cowboy's kind eyes. By the time she reached her ranch, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the modest house and barn that represented all her worldly possessions. After tending to the horses and storing her supplies, Sarah sat alone at the kitchen table, the same table where she and Thomas had shared their dreams. For the first time since the telegram, she allowed herself to weep openly, great racking sobs that left her gasping. "Why did you leave me here alone?" she asked the empty room. "What am I supposed to do now?" No answer came, only the creaking of the house settling in the cooling night air. 3 days later, Sarah made her decision. She rode to the Big Sky Ranch, dressed in her best riding skirt and jacket, her mourning brooch pinned at her throat. The Big Sky was impressive, with a sprawling main house, several outbuildings, and a well-constructed bunkhouse. Cattle dotted the surrounding pastures as far as the eye could see. At the main house, she was directed to the foreman, a grizzled man named Curtis who eyed her with surprise. "Hayes mentioned you might come by," he said, chewing on an unlit cigar. "You ever cooked for a crew before?" "I've cooked for harvest crews and barn raisings. I can handle 20 men." Curtis nodded thoughtfully. "Pays $30 a month plus room and board. Season runs through October, maybe into November depending on the weather." "I have my own ranch to tend to," Sarah said. "I'll need Sundays to check on my place." Curtis frowned. "Not ideal, but we're desperate enough. You can start tomorrow if you're agreeable. Bring whatever personal items you need." And so began Sarah's new routine. She rose before dawn to prepare breakfast for the ranch hands, spent her days baking bread, preparing hearty midday meals for those working near the ranch house, and cooking substantial dinners for the returning crews. The work was exhausting but provided blessed distraction from her grief. Ben Hayes, she learned, was the ranch's head wrangler, responsible for the horses and training the younger hands. He was well respected among the men, fair but firm, and possessed an easy way with the most difficult horses. He treated Sarah with polite respect, careful never to cross the boundaries of propriety despite the close quarters of ranch life. On her first Sunday off, Ben approached her as she prepared to ride back to her homestead. "Would you mind company on the ride, Mrs. Crawford?" "I need to check some fence lines in that direction." Sarah hesitated, aware of how such an arrangement might appear. "I wouldn't want to inconvenience you, Mr. Hayes." "No inconvenience. Those fence lines need checking regardless." They rode in companionable silence for much of the journey, the late summer sun warm on their backs. When they crested the hill overlooking Sarah's ranch, she felt a pang of both love and loss at the sight of the modest buildings nestled in the valley. "Fine-looking place," Ben commented. "Good water source, decent grazing." "Thomas chose well," Sarah agreed. "We came out from Pennsylvania 5 years ago. He had a vision of what this could become." Ben nodded, understanding in his eyes. "My father had the same dream." "Came out from Kentucky after the war with nothing but determination." "Is he at the Big Sky as well?" Sarah asked. A shadow crossed Ben's face. "No, Apaches killed him and my mother when I was 14. I was away fishing when it happened." "I'm sorry," Sarah said softly, recognizing the same loss in his eyes that she felt in her heart. "It was a long time ago," Ben replied, though his expression suggested the wound had never fully healed. "I worked ranch jobs across 3 territories before settling at the Big Sky 3 years back." At the homestead, Ben insisted on checking the buildings and livestock before leaving Sarah to her tasks. "Everything looks in good order," he reported, though that north fence could use some shoring up before winter. "I'll add it to my list," Sarah said, knowing she had neither the strength nor the skill to make the repair properly. Ben seemed to read her thoughts. "I could come by next Sunday, help you with some of these repairs, if you'd allow it." Sarah wanted to refuse to prove she could manage alone, but practicality won out. "That would be very kind, Mr. Hayes." "Ben," he corrected gently. "If we're to be neighbors helping each other, you might as well use my given name." "Ben," she repeated, offering a small smile. "And I'm Sarah, not Mrs. Crawford." Over the following weeks, as autumn painted the Montana landscape in golds and crimsons, Ben became a regular Sunday visitor. Together they repaired fences, reinforced the barn roof, and prepared her small herd for winter. Sarah found herself watching the clock on Saturdays, anticipating his arrival the next morning. One Sunday in late September, they worked together cutting firewood, the rhythmic sound of the saw punctuated by their breathing. Ben had removed his jacket in the unseasonable warmth, his shirt damp with exertion. "Why did you offer me the cooking job?" Sarah asked suddenly, the question that had lingered in her mind for weeks finally finding voice. Ben paused, leaning on the saw handle. "Because you needed it, and we needed a cook." "There must have been others in town who could cook." He studied her face for a moment. "There were, but I saw something in you that day in town, a strength, even in grief, the kind of strength it takes to survive out here." Sarah felt a flush that had nothing to do with physical exertion. Some days I don't feel very strong. Those are the days that matter most, Ben replied. Anyone can be strong when things are easy. After the wood was stacked, they shared a simple meal at Sarah's kitchen table. Ben spoke of his plans to someday have his own ranch, while Sarah found herself sharing memories of Thomas that had been too painful to revisit until now. He was so certain about everything, she said, twisting her wedding ring. So full of faith that we were doing the right thing, that God had a plan for us here. I believed him completely. And now, Ben asked gently, Sarah looked out the window at the land she and Thomas had loved. Now I don't know what to believe. It feels like he took my faith with him when he died. Ben's hand moved across the table, stopping just short of touching hers. Then take mine till yours grows back, he said simply. Sarah looked up, startled by the offer and the emotion behind it. I'm not a religious man, Ben continued, but I believe in what I can see and touch, the land. Good horses, honest work, and people who keep going even when they think they can't. That's not the same as faith in God, Sarah whispered. Maybe not, Ben acknowledged, but it's enough to start with. That night, after Ben had ridden back to the big sky, Sarah stood on her porch looking at the stars. For the first time since Thomas died, she felt a tiny spark of possibility, of a future she couldn't yet imagine but might someday embrace. October brought the fall roundup, and Sarah found herself too busy to dwell on grief or newfound feelings. The ranch hands worked from before dawn until after dusk, and her kitchen became the heart of the operation. She took pride in providing hearty, well-prepared meals that fueled their grueling work. Ben often returned last, ensuring all the horses were properly tended before seeing to his own needs. Sarah found herself setting aside a plate for him, making sure his coffee was hot despite the late hour. You don't need to wait up for me, he told her one night, his face lined with exhaustion. I don't mind, she replied, pouring him a fresh cup. It's good to see everyone home safe. Their eyes met over the steaming mug, and something unspoken passed between them, a current of understanding that needed no words. The roundup ended in late October with the cattle drive to the railhead at Helena. Most of the hands went along, including Ben, leaving the ranch oddly quiet. Sarah used the time to thoroughly clean the bunkhouse and kitchen, trying not to count the days until the men would return. Curtis, who had stayed behind to manage the ranch, found her scrubbing the kitchen floor with unusual vigor. They'll be back in a week or so, he said, his weathered face creasing in a rare smile. That floor won't go anywhere in the meantime. Sarah straightened, pushing back a strand of hair. I know, I just like to keep busy, Curtis nodded, understanding in his eyes. Hayes is a good man, Mrs. Crawford, best horseman I've seen in 30 years of ranching. Sarah felt herself blushing. Mr. Hayes has been very kind in helping me maintain my homestead. Curtis replied noncommittally. Just saying some people deserve a second chance at happiness. My Eliza was a widow when I met her. Thought she'd never smile again, she told me later. Before Sarah could respond, Curtis had retreated, leaving her with thoughts she wasn't ready to examine too closely. The cattle drive returned on a cold, clear November day. Sarah heard the men before she saw them, their voices carrying on the crisp air as they approached the ranch. She found herself scanning the returning riders for Ben's familiar form, her heart leaping when she spotted him bringing up the rear of the procession. That evening, after serving the celebratory dinner, Sarah found Ben sitting alone on the bunkhouse steps, gazing at the star-filled sky. May I join you? She asked, wrapping her shawl tighter against the chill. Always, he replied, moving over to make room. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes before Ben spoke. Curtis tells me you kept everything running smooth while we were gone. It was quieter, certainly, Sarah smiled. Though I missed, she stopped, suddenly self-conscious. What did you miss? Ben asked, his voice gentle in the darkness. The routine, she said, though they both knew it wasn't what she'd intended to say. And my Sundays at the homestead. Ben turned slightly to face her. About that, I rode by your place on our way back, just to check on things. Everything looked fine, but I noticed something. What? Sarah asked, suddenly concerned. The chimney. There's a crack forming on the north side, nothing dangerous yet, but it'll need repair before you light any big fires this winter. Sarah sighed. Another repair, another challenge. I'll add it to my list. I could fix it for you, Ben offered. I'm handy with masonry work. You've already done so much, Ben. I can't keep imposing. In the moonlight, his profile was strong and certain. It's never been an imposition, Sarah. The way he said her name made her breath catch. Thomas had been gone just over 3 months, yet here she sat, her heart responding to another man's voice. Guilt and longing warred within her. I should get back to the kitchen, she said, rising abruptly. There's still cleaning to do. Ben stood as well, but made no move to stop her. Sarah, he said softly as she turned to leave. I'll be there Sunday morning if you'll have me. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and hurried back to the safety of her kitchen. Sunday dawned clear and cold, the first dusting of snow outlining the fences and buildings of Sarah's homestead. She had returned the previous evening, her employment at the Big Sky finished with the end of the roundup. The house felt emptier than ever after weeks of constant activity at the ranch. Sarah busied herself with baking bread and preparing a stew, telling herself it was merely practical to have a hot meal ready for a day of work. It had nothing to do with the anticipation that had kept her awake half the night. Ben arrived mid-morning with a wagon loaded with masonry supplies and tools. Brought everything we might need, he explained, helping her down from the porch. Chimney repair is not something you want to do twice in one winter. They worked together throughout the day, Sarah mixing mortar while Ben carefully removed damaged bricks and replaced them with new ones. The physical labor was a relief, giving her hands purpose and her mind distraction from the confusion in her heart. As the sun began to set, Ben placed the final brick and stepped back to survey his work. That should hold for many winters to come, he said with satisfaction. Sarah handed him a damp cloth to wipe the mortar from his hands. I don't know how to thank you. You could invite me to supper, he suggested with a smile. That stew has been tempting me all afternoon. Over the meal, Ben seemed unusually thoughtful, almost hesitant. When Sarah brought coffee to the table, he cleared his throat. I've been offered a job, he said. Foreman position at a ranch near Bozeman. Good opportunity, more responsibility, and better pay than the Big Sky. Sarah's hand stilled on the coffee pot. That sounds like a fine opportunity, she managed to say, though her heart suddenly felt leaden. When would you start? That's the thing, Ben replied, his eyes steady on hers. I haven't accepted yet. I've been thinking about a different possibility. What's that? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ben took a deep breath. Your ranch has good potential, but it's too much for one person to manage alone. I've been saving for my own place, but starting from scratch takes more capital than I've managed to put aside. Sarah stared at him, uncertain where this was leading. I'm proposing a partnership, Ben continued. My experience and labor combined with your land. We could build something substantial here, maybe even rival the Big Sky someday. A business partnership, Sarah clarified, her pulse quickening. Ben's expression grew more serious. At first, yes. I'd build a cabin for myself over by the north pasture. We'd work the land together, share the profits equally, but Sarah. He hesitated, then reached across the table to take her hand. I hope that in time it might become more than that. Sarah looked down at their joined hands, his sun darkened and work roughened, her smaller but no less marked by frontier life. I know it's too soon, Ben said softly. I know you're still grieving Thomas, and I would never presume to take his place, but I care for you, Sarah. More than I thought possible, tears welled in Sarah's eyes. Ben, I don't know if I can. You don't need to answer now, he interrupted gently. The Bozeman offer will hold until spring. We have time. What if I never? Sarah couldn't finish the thought. Ben's thumb traced a gentle pattern on the back of her hand. Then I'll have had the privilege of working alongside the strongest woman I've ever known, and that would be enough. Sarah withdrew her hand slowly. I need time to think. Of course, Ben agreed, rising from the table. I should head back before it gets any darker. At the door, he turned back to her. Whatever you decide, I meant what I said about my faith. It's yours to borrow for as long as you need it. After he left, Sarah sat alone in her kitchen, thoughts swirling like the snowflakes that had begun to fall outside. Thomas had been her whole world, her compass in the wilderness. The thought of opening her heart again terrified her. Yet Ben had offered something precious, not a replacement for what she had lost, but a new beginning. a faith in possibility when her own had faltered. Winter descended on Montana with its usual ferocity. Sarah maintained her ranch alone, though Ben rode over each Sunday to help with the heavier tasks. They settled into a careful friendship, neither mentioning his proposal as December turned to January and January to February. One Sunday in early March, a blizzard struck with little warning. Ben had arrived before the storm hit, and by mid-afternoon, it was clear he couldn't safely return to the Big Sky. "You can take Thomas's old room," Sarah said, trying to sound matter-of-fact about the impropriety of having an unmarried man stay under her roof. "I'll be fine in the barn," Ben insisted. "I've slept in worse places." "Don't be ridiculous," Sarah replied. "You'll freeze to death, and then where would I be?" A smile tugged at Ben's mouth. "Worried about me, Mrs. Crawford?" "I'm worried about having to explain a frozen cowboy on my property," she retorted, but her eyes betrayed her concern. The storm raged for 2 days, trapping them together in the small house. They played cards, read aloud from Sarah's small collection of books, and talked for hours by the fire. Ben spoke of his childhood in Kentucky, his parents' dreams for a better life out west, and the lonely years after their deaths. Sarah shared stories of her life in Pennsylvania, her courtship with Thomas, and the grueling journey west. On the second evening, as they sat before the fire, Sarah found herself studying Ben's profile, so different from Thomas's but equally compelling in its own way. "What?" he asked, catching her gaze. "I was just thinking how strange life is," she replied honestly. "If Thomas hadn't died, if you hadn't been in town that day to see me stop that runaway horse, we would never have known each other at all." Ben nodded thoughtfully. "My father used to say that life is a series of doors. Some open, some close, but there's always a path forward if you're brave enough to take it." "And if you're not brave?" Sarah asked softly. Ben's eyes were warm in the firelight. "Then someone comes along to lend you courage until you find your own again." Sarah felt tears threatening and looked away. "I miss him still. I think I always will." "As you should," Ben said. "Loving again doesn't mean forgetting." The simple truth of his words broke something open inside her. "I'm afraid," she whispered. "Of what?" "Of losing again, of the pain." Ben moved closer, taking her hand in his. "That's the bargain we make with love, the joy for the risk of pain. But Sarah, having seen both sides now, I can tell you the joy is worth it." Looking into his earnest face, Sarah believed him. Slowly, hesitantly, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle, a whispered promise rather than a passionate declaration, but it held the seed of something that could grow strong and true. When they parted, Ben's eyes were bright with emotion. "Does this mean you'll consider my proposal?" "I'm considering it," Sarah replied, a smile breaking through her tears. "But I have conditions." "Name them," Ben said immediately. "We build the cabin, as you suggested. We work as partners through the spring and summer. And if, by harvest time, we both still feel this way, then we can discuss a more permanent arrangement." Ben's face broke into that gap-toothed smile she had come to cherish. "Those terms are acceptable, Mrs. Crawford." The storm cleared the next morning, revealing a world transformed by snow. Before Ben left, they stood together on the porch, looking out over the glittering landscape. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Sarah said. "Even after the storm." "Especially after the storm," Ben replied, his arm warm around her shoulders. As spring thawed the frozen land, Ben began construction on his cabin, though he spent more time working alongside Sarah to prepare the ranch for a prosperous year. They planted a larger vegetable garden than Sarah had attempted before, increased the size of the cattle herd with calves purchased from the Big Sky, and repaired every fence on the property. By summer, Ben's cabin stood finished, though he seemed in no hurry to occupy it. Their partnership flourished, the ranch thriving under their combined efforts. More importantly, the careful friendship that had begun in grief was blossoming into something deeper and more lasting. On a warm August evening, they sat together on Sarah's porch, watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk. Sarah wore a blue dress instead of black, a change she had made gradually as spring turned to summer. "Harvest will be here soon," Ben remarked casually. "Time passes quickly when there's purpose in your days." Sarah nodded, understanding the unspoken question. I've been thinking about our arrangement. Have you now? Ben asked, trying and failing to sound nonchalant. Sarah turned to face him fully. I think it's time we discuss that more permanent arrangement you mentioned. Ben's expression grew serious. Are you certain, Sarah? I meant it when I said I'd wait as long as needed. Sarah took his hand, running her thumb over the calluses earned from months of shared labor. Thomas will always have a place in my heart, but I've discovered my heart is large enough for more than one love. Ben's smile could have outshone the emerging stars. Is that a yes to my proposal then? It's a yes to a new proposal, Sarah replied with newfound confidence. Not just a business partnership, but a life partnership, a marriage if you'll have me. Ben dropped to one knee before her, still holding her hand. Sarah Crawford, nothing would make me happier than to build a life with you on this land. Will you marry me? Yes, she said simply. With all my heart, yes. They were married in October, after the harvest was in and the cattle secured for winter. The ceremony was held on their ranch. Sarah had begun to think of it as theirs months ago, with the big sky hands and neighbors from miles around in attendance. As they spoke their vows before the traveling minister, Sarah felt a sense of rightness settle over her. She would always carry the memory of Thomas, but Ben had helped her faith grow back, stronger and deeper than before. Not just faith in God, but faith in herself and in the possibility of love after loss. That night, as they stood on the porch of the house that would be their home, Sarah looked up at the star-filled Montana sky. Thank you, she whispered, speaking both to the heavens and to the man beside her. For what? Ben asked, his arms encircling her waist. For lending me your faith when mine was gone, for being patient, for showing me that endings can also be beginnings. Ben kissed her then, a promise of the life they would build together. Some things are worth waiting for, he said simply. And as they walked hand in hand into their home, Sarah knew that the path forward, though different from what she had once imagined, would be rich with possibility and love.